I just texted a friend, wanted to check in with him. He did a lot and is still doing a lot of great voluntary work trying to help with the situation in Point Reyes. And he updated me. He said he's getting concerned about the water situation in some of the ponds. And I was just taken aback by how we're still having the same conversations this many years later. And when did I make The Shame of Point Reyes? 2018. And I made that film looking back at the first notable drought, the note that really started to get people to pay attention to the massive elk die-offs. So really we're looking at several years prior to that, the suffering of the elk was clear and undeniable. Now it's almost 2025. And here's the side topic of today's show. It's amazing how effective it is to put things out of your mind. You know, just put it out of your mind, out of sight, out of mind, and suddenly the suffering of all of these creatures starts to go away, even though it never ended. And this is the reason that people can't look at where their food comes from. This is why people get very upset at activists that try and put it in their face. Because you see it enough times and you either just settle on the fact that you are, in fact, a piece of trash human being who fully embraces the suffering, or some people like to pretend that they embrace it, like this tough persona. But that's different than people who can actually look at it. Because when I was really getting deep into trying to expose animal agriculture, it's crushing. It's crushing the things that you see. Crushing. And this is the industry of the people that we call good people. And speaking of good people, I wanted to talk about Judge Gilliam, an absolute piece of trash of a human being. And I don't know how many people know, but I was one of the plaintiffs with the lawsuits against the Park Service, trying to force their hand to help the elk. And after a couple of years, I chose not to continue to be a part of that. I didn't like their approach, and I didn't like the fact that I couldn't speak because I wanted to call out this piece of trash judge. I got to find his face and put it up on the screen. I'll give you a summary. We would, as citizens, with our own free time, since you couldn't expect to get anything from the actual Park Service, who are supposed to be helping the animals, would have to go out and document all the deaths and the grisly manner by which the elk were dying, and show the death count. Like some years it's 30%, 40%, 50% of the entire population. That's how bad things get. Can you imagine? Can you imagine any human population that you just lost 50% of them and you blew it off? You're like, it's natural. Again, the disconnect. Man, sometimes I don't think what our brains are capable of is necessarily a positive, because we just use it to lie to ourselves. Anyway, this piece of trash judge would actually say, well, you just don't have enough evidence. And so my question on these calls when talking to the legal team was, what is the counter evidence? And the counter evidence was that the Park Service said they don't agree. That was it. That was it. And the judge goes with, well, it's the Park Service. I'm going to go with what they said. Come back with more evidence. Come back with more evidence. And I said, what evidence will work? And I went down the list of everything that we provided, and it was as blatant and obvious and undeniable as it could be. Like, you couldn't come up with anything crazier if you wanted to. There's no such thing as getting enough evidence if the evidence that we provided wasn't enough. And the only evidence that the judge needed was for the Park Service to just put forth a statement. Nah, not true. It's insane. It's really insane. And why did I go down this Judge Gilliam path? Because what we were doing was fighting urgently for emergency relief for the elk because things were that bad. And it didn't happen. Well, it did and it didn't. This is a sub story in itself. This is why it's so hard to make documentaries about Point Reyes, because the things happening out there, the list of insanity just keeps mounting and mounting. So here's what took place. While the Park Service was fighting us in court not to have to legally help the animals, who, by the way, their mandate says they're supposed to preserve and protect and restore. While they're fighting not to do their very jobs in court, at one point during this process came the troughs and their partnership with Grattan Whiteria. Rancheria, the whitest Native Americans that exist in California, the most whitewashed people in California. What a shock that the Park Service chose them. Wow, I'm making a lot of enemies today, but at this point, I don't have any friends, so who cares? Let's keep telling the truth. So the Park Service, clearly, to me, that was pretty clear evidence that this was nothing more than a publicity stunt. They were being shamed in national headlines. The demonstrations that were taking place out there, the show of support from the public going out to these demonstrations and these protests were significant. And I think this was even being covered on the East Coast in the New York Times and things like that. Just how bad the situation was for the wildlife in Point Reyes and how incompetent the Park Service was behaving. So to try and get a little pressure off of themselves, they went ahead and brought out some of these troughs. And man, there's a side story because their maintenance of the troughs was an absolute joke. And this, I say again, this was happening while they were fighting in court not to help the elk. So you got to ask, okay, so would a legal obligation have caused them to do more? What would it have caused them to have to do? I will tell you that the first placement of the troughs was where the troughs were needed the least, but were where the public eye would be able to see them. They were also very convenient. You know, they were right at the beginning of the elk reserve, right off the road. And again, like I said, right where tourists could see that they had done it. And where the water was needed the most was the opposite end of Tamal's Point, where we had to fight and push for them to put more troughs out. And then the troughs came to an end. You know, they never bothered to refill them. They never bothered to clean them once. And the years just keep going by. The years just keep going by. And there's only so much I can take. You know, I sent myself into poverty and incredible debt working on this project, only to see that we're up against corruption at the greatest level. You're up against animal agriculture. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. And I worked on other things. You know, I took peeks to see what was happening, but I got to tell you, I stopped really being emotionally involved in it. Unfortunately, for my sake, I was emotionally involved in other environmental problems, but I couldn't handle all of them at the same time. And I couldn't keep looking at the suffering, not just of the elk, but whenever the elk come up, you have to look at the reason that the elk are suffering. And the reason the elk are suffering is the devotion to animal agriculture. And that's where the true suffering lies. The things that, if you get a glimpse at it, will really F you up. And the suffering has just gone on year after year. I separated myself, and it was better for me. But one of the reasons it was so hard for me to do so is the guilt and the sense of irresponsibility. The knowledge that the problem was still there. The suffering kept going. But I was like, well, I've had enough. Isn't it convenient for us humans to be able to at least have that choice? Even if I'm choosing to continue to suffer, at least it's my choice. You know, with these animals, their choices have been taken away from them, particularly the agricultural animals, but even the elk. The elk don't have the opportunity to improve their lives because they're fenced in. That's pretty messed up. Oh, most of the plants there are invasive, poisonous, things you can't really eat, can't support the population there. And on top of that, you don't have any water. Well, maybe move on to somewhere else. Oh, you can't. That's nice. Nice plate of options there. And this is happening inside of a national park. Don't ever tell me that the power of animal agriculture isn't frightening. You know, you got these multimillionaires out there who still have our idiot population chanting how they're just poor, struggling families trying to feed America. And nothing could be further from the truth. Anyway, that's a side topic. The real topic was the amount of time that goes by. And when I was out there filming it, in my first attempts at these films, I was really trying to get people to understand what it would be like to go through what they go through every day, the struggle that they go through every day. I got a tiny taste, you know, when I'd be out there hiking to get footage, and it would turn into a very, very, very long day. And sometimes I'd get stuck deep in there without food or water, and the food wasn't as bad as what you start to feel when you desire water. And all I had to do was eventually get back to my car and I'd be fine. These animals, at the end of a hard day, still have to keep fighting for survival and still haven't found food or water. And yet the next day comes. Now multiply that by the years that have gone by. The years that have gone by. And the animals that have simply died of poisoning, ingesting the wrong thing, lack of thirst, lack of hydration, lack of nutrition, entanglement in the barbed wire. All these things that should not be taking place at all, but certainly not in a national park. There've been a few years that weren't as bad as others. There was some good rain, or at least compared to the never-ending drought, the never-ending heat waves. You know, when places like Point Reyes become too hot to hike through, that's pretty alarming. Anyway, the suffering goes on. We as humans just choose not to think about it anymore. Isn't that nice?